right, so let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the 40th Virtual History of 2021. I am Molly Ricks and I'm with Baltimore Heritage. First, I'd like to thank everyone who has donated with us to be here today. Your support enables the Baltimore Architecture Foundation and Baltimore Heritage to host these virtual histories each week. A few announcements before we get started. Next week, there we go. Next week, for our final virtual history of the year on December 17th, we will be joined by Mahan Reichel to learn about the design of the recently reopened Rash Field. And that's actually our only announcement for today. So now for today's presentation. Professor Anne Sarah Rubin joined the UMBC History Department in the fall of 2000. Her teaching and research focuses on the American Civil War, the US South, 19th century America, and digital history. She has published 2 books and has also worked extensively with electronic media. In today's presentation, we are delighted to have her introduce to us her project, Slave Streets, Free Streets, Visualizing the Landscape of Early Baltimore. And if you have any questions, you can add them to the chat or the Q&A. And thank you for being here with us, Anne. And now I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Molly, and for inviting me. And thanks also to the Baltimore Architecture Foundation for having me. I'm always thrilled to talk about this project. I am going to share my screen. I've got a little PowerPoint about this research project I've been working on for the past few years, but then we will hopefully have a lot of time for questions. Okay, great. So, what if you could immerse yourself in a Google Maps for 200 years ago, where you're virtually strolling down the streets and wharves of early Republic Baltimore? What would that visualization tell you about the city of the past and about the people of the past? And what this project is trying to do is answer that question with a special focus on the African Americans who lived in the Baltimore of 200 years ago, which would be about 4,300 enslaved people and about 10,300 free African Americans. So we build this project on an existing project that many of you are familiar with, which is Visualizing Early Baltimore, or the Bearings of Baltimore. It's actually available in a couple of places. You can see it in real life on a kiosk at the Maryland, it was the Maryland Historical Society. What is it now? It's the Maryland Center for History and Culture, where it's part of their War of 1812 exhibit. And it's also available online at earlybaltimore.org. And we can play around with it a little bit in a minute. But what Slave Streets, Free Streets does is take this map and use it as a way to show how slavery was fully enmeshed in the city of Baltimore, and how that in some ways the city of Baltimore actually looks more integrated in the past than it does today, but also the ways in which that integration was clearly limited. So this is an image just of zooming in on the map of Baltimore. This project also reminds us of the degree to which racial slavery and capitalism spun a web 200 years ago that people struggled to extricate themselves from. And the last piece of what we're trying to do is really put faces and names to the largely anonymous, ordinary working people of the past. And we're trying to make an argument about the power of visualization as a storytelling medium, and to show how using a map as your storytelling medium can illuminate relationships of power and of place. So this is, again, a zoom in. Whatever I do, I used to work for the Imaging Research Center at UMBC, which is where this project originated from and is housed. And we did a lot of tours for people and often a lot of tours for school groups. And there's nothing better than having a group of kids from Baltimore, you know, fourth graders, eighth graders, whatever. And you come in and you're showing them this map of 200 years ago. And then you zoom in and you say, oh, look, there's Lexington Market. And of course, they all know Lexington Market. So to show them that the past and the present overlap all the time. Oops. So since 2012, actually it was funded originally as part of the bicentennial of the War of 1812 and of the Star Spangled Banner. So since 2012, the Imaging Research Center and my collaborator on this project, Dan Bailey, have been working on this digital visualization of early Baltimore. So they combined historical research with cutting edge mapping and modeling technologies to recreate an accurate 3D model of the city, of its terrain, of its land use, where buildings would have been circa 1815. And the bearings of Baltimore, that image I just showed you, is in fact 2.5 billion pixels with a bird's eye view. And part of the reason it has this kind of stretched out view was because it had to get Fort McHenry in, obviously. And it's navigable completely. You can zoom into the vast details of the city. At UMBC, we actually have it's called a cave. It's like a giant room of monitors that you can project things on, and you can project it on there, and it looks incredible. But it's also really important to understand that this is an accurate, or as accurate a representation as we think we can do. It's built on the topography. IRC modelers worked with local historians and experts to find buildings that still exist, to discover what older buildings would have looked like, to place them. They're modeled and they're textured in really beautiful detail. And then there's hotspots. Let's see if this will work for me. Whoops. There's hotspots. So like Lexington Market, if you click on these, they'll bring you to a little bit extra information. So this is the plan of Baltimore. I believe this is the Poppleton map. And this is showing where a lot of the topography came from by using a more modern map and then erasing features. And this is what the underlying topography looks like, including there's harbor bathymetry. So out here is where Fort McHenry would be, and here's the city. So that's the overall project. And then I got involved to talk about African Americans in early Baltimore, focusing in on the years 1815 to 1820. So our main focus for Slave Streets, Free Streets are 4 themes or 4 layers, where we're looking at the lives of free Blacks, we're looking at the lives of enslaved workers, we're looking at places associated with the slave trade, the sites and the workings of the slave trade. And we're also looking at stories of fugitives, of people who escaped slavery, either escaped slavery in Baltimore and ran someplace else, or also often ran to Baltimore with its large free Black population from the surrounding areas, Anne Arundel County and places like that. We do this by drawing on all kinds of records. The Baltimore City Archives and Ed Poppenfuss have been hugely helpful to us. So we draw on records like city directories, tax records, we use the census. We've done a lot of research in newspapers by sampling 1 issue a month, other kinds of historical documents. And we're able to rediscover people, including the names of free and enslaved residents at locations around the city and tying them by name to specific addresses. So this is actually a sampling showing from, I think this would be from about 1815, 1816 newspapers. All of these dots are sites associated with fugitives. So coming out of a fugitive slave ad, either someone placing an ad or somebody saying, well, we think so-and-so ran to Baltimore because I happen to know this is because his brother was a free Black man who had a brickyard, things like that. We also have, this is actually just showing some of the many sites where people were actually bought and sold. Baltimore didn't have um, its own a single slave market like you might have seen in other cities. And so in fact, the buying and selling of people went on throughout the city, although you can see it's concentrated on what would be today Baltimore Street. Is a pretty heavy concentration of it. Um, we also, oops, let me come back. So this is showing, again, just as addresses associated. We don't have the white addresses mapped, but we have the free slaves, the free blacks and enslaved people showing where they're living. As much as possible, what we've done is drawn on sources that were already transcribed, and then we've turned those transcriptions or done our own transcribing and turned that into a series of databases. And what we've done is every time we come across a unique individual, we then assign them a unique ID number, so that eventually the idea would be that you could track somebody across sources. Free blacks we've most easily found looking for them in city directories and in tax records. Enslaved people are definitely the hardest people to find names for, because while they would be counted in the census, they were not listed individually in the census. They were simply, if you've ever seen the 1820 census, I don't know why you would have, but they have a tick marks going across, just to say that, X number of people between the ages of 14 and 25, X number of people between the ages of 26 and 30, things like that. However, there's a Baltimore City tax list from 1818. Actually, there's also one from 1813 that two women at the Baltimore City Archives transcribed and published, which we purchased with their permission, that actually lists enslaved people by name under the headings of their enslavers. Of course, chillingly, the reason that they're listed by name and by age is so that they could be valued for tax purposes. So the newspaper has been the most valuable to us for seeing the slave trade, and also for seeing fugitives. The other issues that we've run into, though, have to do actually with the limitations of our sources. I'm a 19th century historian by training, and so to me, the absences are frustrating but not unusual, right? That we can find somebody in one document but not another, or somebody might be in an 1819 city directory but not in the 1820 census, for example, or vice versa. Anyone who's ever tried to do genealogy, particularly genealogy for African Americans, knows the real dearth of information as we try to bring forward people's individual names. And so one of the things we've had to do, and again, I'm a historian, so it's fine with me, is become really comfortable with uncertainty, right? Do we know that these two people with the same name are the same person? Maybe, maybe not. If it's an unusual name, sure. If the name is John Smith, it's harder to tell. Or what if somebody is named Elizabeth Jones in one document, but comes up in another document in the same address as Betty Jones? Probably the same person. So there's a lot of, I don't want to call it guesswork, but I guess I would call it informed speculation to what we're doing. The other issue we really dealt with a lot that I had not foreseen has to do actually with the imprecision of addresses. So one thing we've been trying to do is map where African Americans lived on Strawberry Alley. Strawberry Alley is now Dallas Street in Fells Point. But if you look, so here you can see these are free blacks on Strawberry Alley. You can actually glean a ton of information, right? So we've got their last names, we've got their first names, we've got their occupations, which are pretty interesting. Um, then it gets a little tighter. So street details is how they're listed, whether it's in the tax records or in the city directory. And you can see, okay, great. So we know that Mr. Cornish lived at 6 Strawberry Alley, or that we know that Cato Day, the caulker, lived at 62 Strawberry Alley. So that seems like they would be easy to locate, except that Baltimore, like every city at this period, did not have standardized house numbering. So we've had to sort of guess where the numbers might have started. The late Mary Ellen Hayward, a great historian of Fells Point, was really helpful to us for that, because there is actually there's one city directory from 1804 that goes in house order instead of alphabetical order. I'm getting a little bit in the weeds here. But so house numbers are not very useful to us because they're numbered inconsistently. That's also why in early addresses you see a lot of half numbers, 13 and a half, such and such a street. Um, it's actually a little bit easier for us. Okay, so corner, that's good, right? Corner is good. We can pretty much figure out where that is. Um, Between two streets is good, right? Between Wilk Street and Fleet Street, we can narrow that down. South of, north of, how far? How near is near? How between is between? So what we've done is we've tried to place people is to try to follow a set of rules. Near means less than half, right? Um, Obviously, directions are good. West side of the street, east side of the street, again, we don't know. So one issue that we're thinking a lot about is, first of all, how do we represent people? Do we represent them? Right now, they're just represented as dots. We don't ever want to get to that uncanny valley where we're trying to pretend that we know what people looked like, because we don't. So we've thought about maybe using silhouettes or shadows. The other thing that we're thinking about doing for people that we don't know, we know they live on Strawberry Alley, but we don't know where, is to literally represent them walking on the street. Because again, we don't know exactly where they lived, but we know they would have walked down the street. And so to think of the street as the kind of space that we're most interested in, because it's the street where people are really interacting and meeting each other. Another issue for us is when we're talking, this is an image of free blacks, but when we talk about enslaved people, how do we foreground them and show where they lived rather than foregrounding them under their enslaver? We're not really sure how to do that yet either. This was, again, just a sample for an image, but this is showing Fells Point. So here's the Fells Point Market, still in the same place. And a red building means it's associated with a fugitive. An orange building would mean it's associated with the slave trade. And then the blue buildings are associated with enslaved workers, and the green buildings with free blacks. And then we put in a couple of purple ones just to show also associated with whites. And what we've really come to realize as we've done this work is that, ironically, it's proven to be easier to reconstruct and symbolically represent the buildings. And that's not easy. It's taken tons and tons of work, obviously, to figure out what a building would have looked like in a time before photography. But even that is perhaps easier than to actually reconstruct the lives of the people who lived and worked within those buildings. So let me stop this. I'll switch what I'm doing and open up my the actual map so we can see that for a minute. So you can actually zoom all the way in. I love this so much. I still never get tired of using it. So the modelers are just incredible, the work they've been able to do. I'm not as adept on this with my home trackpad. But again, so you can see some of the wharves and the houses. And since I know a lot of you are interested in architecture, what I will say is that most of these buildings are not accurate representations. They're composites. So if we know from a description, or we know the building existed, or there were photographs, anything that we could know what the building looked like, the building is modeled to look like the building. The rest of them are just a mix of types of buildings. So the footprints are usually pretty close, but some of the details, like the numbers of windows and things like that, are educated guesses. Informed speculation, I think, is what I called it. So I actually have no idea how long I've spoken for, but I'm gonna stop and see if there are questions or comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Rubin. We do have some questions. I'm just going to kind of filter through here.
Okay.
So at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned the total population of Baltimore. And so here's the question. What was the total population of Baltimore at this time for the stats Dr. Rubin cited on the Black population?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now I can't remember the exact number of whites, but I think it's about 42,000. So it would be about 42,000 whites, a little over 10,000 free Blacks, and a little over 4,000 people who were enslaved. And this is 1820. So Baltimore is about to have a huge population explosion again. The other thing that I would really highlight, and one of the reasons that Baltimore is so fascinating to study in this period, is that unlike any other Southern city, Baltimore has a much higher population of free Blacks than it does enslaved workers. And you don't see that in any place like Richmond or New Orleans or Charleston. And that's a function of the nature of slavery in Maryland, which is going through this big transition starting really after the Revolutionary War, as Maryland farmers shift away from tobacco, start growing cereal crops, and Maryland becomes a place, first of all, where many Blacks are able to be freed, but also where Maryland becomes a slave exporter. And so enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia too, but mostly in our case, we're talking about Maryland, are sold to the deeper South. And actually, this is a very long answer, but one of the things that's really fascinating by looking at this 1815 to 1820 is we can see the beginnings of this shift in the slave trade coming out of Baltimore, where before it was a very local, people were buying and selling other people, but generally locally. And what you can see actually starting around 1817, 1818 are slave traders coming in, and they place advertisements in the paper saying wanted to buy 40 or 50 people at a time. And these people then are sold and shipped either to first maybe to the Carolinas or Georgia, and then often to New Orleans, and are the people who wind up working and populating the Gulf South, so Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, even probably a little bit into Texas. So it's this real moment that you can see.
Wow. Okay, great. And a kind of a related question. There were a couple questions in the Q&A in the chat about being put back into slavery, and either this is finding fugitives or kidnapping and that sort of thing. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that definitely definitely can happen. So Baltimore in this period, it's an attractive place for people to run to because it does have this large population, and so people can kind of get lost a little bit. They're harder to find, and it's a kind of a way station. There are, I've not looked specifically at people who are free being captured and kidnapped. There's been a whole bunch of books about these slave kidnappings, or like there's the Solomon Northup is probably the most famous. Those are actually from later. Those are more like 1840s, which is not to say it's not happening in Baltimore, but I don't know of any cases specifically where it's happening. And the fugitive slave law, there is a fugitive slave law on the books, but it's kind of weak. It's not enforced that well. And it's interesting though, part of what I think is also what you do see a lot of in the fugitive slave ads is the number of people who are in mixed status families, where it's so and so ran away to Baltimore where he has a brother who is free or a mother who is free, or so that, but of course that's not where they're going to hide, because that's the first place someone's going to look for them. So I've not delved into it as deeply as other scholars have, for sure.
Great. So there's been a bunch of questions about, first of all, the difference between an alley and a street, and also then specifically Strawberry Alley. Is that in fact where Frederick Douglass lived? Is that now Dallas Street? And then finally, is there any, are you going to incorporate Frederick Douglass because you're looking at Strawberry Alley? So that whole
Right. These are all great questions. I actually, because I am not an architectural historian, don't know the difference between an alley and a street, except to say that they're smaller. And one thing that we have seen as we started mapping people, and we mostly work with Fells Point because Mary Ellen Hayward had done a lot of work on Fells Point, is there's definitely evidence that whites and wealthier whites are living on the streets, and poor blacks, free blacks and poor whites are living in the alleys. And Mary Ellen actually had a book about the alley houses, the small alley houses, and like the Caulkers houses and things like that. So I think that's largely the difference, is one of size and kind of scale. I don't know how well that's going to pop up in here. So like this looks like it's probably one of the alleys. We hadn't planned on doing anything with Frederick Douglass just because he's so much later. He's only born in 1818. And so the period he's in Baltimore, I think, is 1838-ish. So I hadn't really planned on it, although, of course, I think Frederick Douglass is fascinating. And there is, I don't know if it's publicly available, but Professor Lawrence, is it Johnson? Lawrence Johnson at Hopkins, who's in English and history, has done a map of Frederick Douglass's Baltimore. He's done it with his students, where you can trace Frederick Douglass around Baltimore, but I'm not sure if it's up, like if it's public. Yeah, so.
Great. Sorry. I was trying to find it. It was up a while ago. So
right. But I don't know if it still is.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Also, a couple questions, and I think this is one of the most remarkable things about the map, is how it's not as if the fugitive enslaved people are all going to one area. It's all mixed together. It's all, and so people are saying, they're going to places that are right next to where other people are being sold and that sort of thing. Could you talk about that a little bit? And also, just if you knew how many places in Baltimore could one buy or sell people? Do you know?
Yeah. So one of the great, let me see if I can get to it off of this. One of the great things, one of the fascinating things about studying Baltimore. So this is actually a dot density map of Baltimore. Now the dots are sorted by ward, and within the ward, they're placed randomly. But what you can see, of course, is that free people and enslaved people, there's not one district where free people live. There's not one neighborhood where enslaved people live. They really all do live together. And so in that regard, Baltimore is weirdly kind of, I don't want to call it integrated. Sorry, this isn't the page I was looking for, of course. But it's not as segregated as the city becomes. And partly that's because in a place like Baltimore, this is Strawberry Alley, again, no city in the South is segregated before the Civil War, because the laws delineating who's enslaved, who's free, the law, it all seems so clear to people that there's not seen by the white elite, don't see a need to rigidly codify segregation. The fact that people are running away, and a lot of those places, they're not necessarily, they may be the home of a person who placed the ad. So that's why some of them may look that way, for sure. But yes, I mean, because Baltimore is largely an integrated place, and because, for example, you know, there might be a building. We have a story that we talk about, who Don Carlos Hall, who's a businessman. So he runs a boot black shop, like a shoe shine shop, in the basement of a building on Baltimore Street. So, you know, there's just so much, everything is so intertwined. In terms of a number of places where people could be bought and sold in the city of Baltimore, that number is, I would have to say, every inch of the city is a place where someone could conceivably be bought or sold. And the numbers that we have are deceptive, or the addresses that we have are deceptive, because a really high percentage of buying and selling advertisements don't have a location associated with them. They just say to inquire at the newspaper office, which means that it's happening, but it's happening everywhere. It's happening in private homes. It's happening in people's workshops. It's happening on the wharves. It's inextricably woven into the fabric of the city. And I think that's something that's really important to understand, because it means that there's no way to escape it. It's an omnipresent fact of life in Baltimore City at the time, and frankly, in every slaveholding city at the time.
There are so many great questions and comments on here, and so we'll do a couple more if that's okay with everybody. We're not going to get to everything, but and we'll give you this chat, Dr. Rubin, because there's
thank you.
People offering services, and
great.
A 5th grade school teacher from a charter school is here, and she's there's a question from the students. How long did it take you to research and to do this project, and is the research still going on?
So it took a very long time. The original map, the Bearings of Baltimore map, took 2 years for people at the IRC to research and model. And I didn't actually have anything to do with that part of it. I found out about it as it was being finished. And I said to Dan Bailey, I said, I can't believe you haven't called me, because you really need a historian. And I sort of elbowed my way into working on it. The research in Slave Street, Free Streets, it's hard to quantify how much it took, because I did a bunch of it. I had some graduate students do some of it, maybe about a year. And it's a little bit on hiatus. There's actually, Dan Bailey and the staff at the IRC is working on a big revision of the map, where the map will be much more accurate. It's going to have a lot more buildings. The topography is better. So that is supposed to be done maybe in the next few months. In terms of Slave Streets, Free Streets, it's a little bit on hold right now, because I'm actually a Civil War historian. This has been more of a side project for me. So I've kind of gone on to other things, although I am hoping still to use it, because we have so much data and so much research kind of banked, to use it with my classes and things like that. And eventually, after the new map is completed, we've talked to the librarians over at the Pratt and the people who run the Digital Maryland, which is part of the Digital Public Library of America. And we do want to sort of deposit all of our raw materials so that other people can use them.
That's wonderful. And so many people will be able to access all that you've done. That's great. Last question. Can you talk about how the end of manumission in Maryland affected the population of free Blacks? It seems the free population grew directly from their ability to obtain freedom during their lifetime. Was there a huge shift in numbers?
So I'm a little confused, because manumission never ends in Maryland. I mean, people are always able, it gets harder, certainly, but what evolves is more the institution of term slavery, which is somebody is enslaved and makes an agreement that they will be freed after a certain, either at a certain age, usually 28, or after a certain number of years. And that's a legally binding, legally transferable agreement. And so you do see a lot of times actually in the ads that they'll say like wanted to sell, you know, a cook who has 7 years left to serve, things like that. But it never, Baltimore always has, and Maryland always has more, maybe not the entire state, but certainly Baltimore has more free Blacks than enslaved people, which makes it, I just think, such an interesting place. If you are interested in manumissions and those kinds of issues, I would really recommend, it's not about Baltimore, but Will Thomas's book, A Question of Freedom, which is about Prince George's County and freedom suits. It's a little earlier. He's mostly looking, well, I guess he goes up actually to around the 1840s, but 1790s to around 1830. It's very good.
Wonderful, thank you. So there's a lot more questions in here. I'm going to put my email in the chat, so you can email me and I can pass things on to Dr. Rubin. Dr. Rubin, thank you so much again.
Thank you, it's been my pleasure.
Wonderful. All right, everyone, bye-bye.
Bye.